Why fantasy fails? Why does fantasy collapse at the very moment it feels most secure?
Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're using a really fascinating short story to tackle one of the trickiest ideas in psychoanalysis. We're going to get right into the heart of how desire actually works. So let's start with a question that I think, we've all probably wrestled with at some point. You build up this perfect scenario in your head. You imagine every little detail. But when the moment comes, reality just doesn't follow the script, and you're left feeling disappointed. Why does that happen so often? Well, to explore this, we're not going to crack open a dense textbook. Instead, our guide is a short story called Daydreams. It gives us this character, a man named Sithara, and his journey is just a perfect, real-world example of a very complex psychological theory. All right, so here's our game plan. First, we're going to look at what the story calls a civilized excuse Sithara uses to protect himself. Then, we'll watch him try to script the perfect fantasy, only for it to smash into something called the wound of the real. From there, we'll unpack why there's no magic formula for desire, and we'll wrap up with the story's very strange and very revealing final image, the spider's final word. Okay, let's dive right in. To really get Sithara, we first have to understand this elaborate defense mechanism he's built around himself. This right here, this is Sithara's personal mantra. It's a line he tells himself over and over. And on the surface, it sounds pretty profound, almost noble, doesn't it? He uses it to make sense of his romantic failures and to justify why he never approaches the women he claims to respect. But here's the real question we have to ask. What is this belief actually doing for him? Because this high-minded idea, it isn't really about finding love. It's an incredibly sophisticated excuse. It's a psychological shield. So what's he shielding himself from? He's protecting himself from a deep, primal anxiety that the psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan called symbolic castration. Now, stay with me, this isn't literal. It's about that universal human feeling of being incomplete, that sense of a fundamental lack. For men, this often bubbles up as a paralyzing fear of being seen as inadequate, of failing, of being rejected. And this isn't just some abstract theory from a book. You see these kinds of defenses everywhere. Think about the person who's always waiting for the right one. It's often a way to avoid the risk of rejection. Or the super macho guy who can't stop bragging. He's usually covering up a deep insecurity. Sithara's civilized motto is just a more poetic version of the same old strategy. Do whatever it takes to avoid facing that core fear of not being enough. So, feeling crushed by this fear, Sithara decides he needs to seize control. He's going to engineer an encounter that, in his mind, absolutely cannot fail. His solution? To take all the risk, all the unpredictability of romance completely off the table. He arranges to meet a prostitute, a woman named Sonali. He figures a paid transaction is the perfect script. There's no chance of refusal, the roles are clear, and for once, he can be in total control. But you see, he's not actually trying to connect with Sonali the person. He is actively constructing her as an object in his fantasy. In Lacanian theory, this is the objet a, an idealized thing that exists only to fill a role in your script. He calls her his dream angel, a perfect, flawless figure with no messy history, no pain, no complications of her own. And this just lays it out so clearly, doesn't it? The enormous gap between the fantasy world in his head and the cold, hard reality of the situation. He's chasing this idea of a perfect, seamless union, but what he's actually participating in is a commodified transaction where satisfaction is supposed to be guaranteed by money, not a genuine connection. But here's where it all takes a turn, because that carefully built, supposedly foolproof fantasy is about to run smack into something it just can't process, something it can't control. At the absolute climax of the story, right when his fantasy is supposed to become reality, Sithara spots something that's not in the script, a wound on Sonali's heel. It's such a small detail, but in that single moment, his entire world shatters. His desire, it doesn't just fade, it completely vanishes. This wound is a perfect example of what Lacan called the real. Now, the real isn't just reality. It's the raw, often traumatic truth that our fantasies are designed to pave over. That wound represents everything his dream angel fantasy was meant to erase. Sonali's actual life, her history, her pain, her exploitation. It's a piece of the real world that his script simply has no lines for. So the total collapse of Sithara's plan isn't just a story about one guy's failure. It's actually the key to the story's whole argument, and it leads us straight to one of Lacan's most famous and most unsettling ideas. And that idea is this: there is no sexual relationship. I know. It sounds incredibly bleak, but it might not mean what you think it means. See, Lacan isn't saying that love or connection are impossible. What he's saying is that there is no perfect formula. There's no foolproof script, no transaction, no sequence of perfect moves that can guarantee a harmonious fusion between two people. That gap between two separate minds, two separate histories, it can never be completely closed. Sithara's fantasy crashed and burned because it was built on the lie that such a formula could exist. So, where does that leave us? Well, after the fantasy goes up in smoke, the story doesn't give us some neat little moral about being a better person. Instead, it ends with this powerful and honestly pretty disturbing metaphor for what's left behind. The entire story, both at the very beginning and at the very end, is framed by this one single image: a spider dragging a cockroach away. And believe me, this isn't just a random creepy detail, it's the key that unlocks the story's final point. That image of the spider completely reframes everything we just saw. It suggests that this encounter wasn't about failed intimacy at all. It was about predation. It implies that both Sithara and Sonali are just caught in the web of a much larger impersonal system. In this light, Sithara isn't the villain, and Sonali isn't just a victim. They're both just playing parts in a bigger structure, a capitalist machine that literally profits from the exact kind of inadequacy Sithara feels. Her wound isn't an accident, it's the mark of that system on her body. So here's the crucial takeaway. Sithara's personal fantasy? It failed, spectacularly. But the underlying structure that produced his anxiety and her exploitation in the first place, that's still there, completely untouched. The system just keeps humming along. And all of this leaves us with one last big question to wrestle with. The story does an amazing job of showing us how fantasy fails. So it forces us to ask, if we have to throw out our perfect scripts, what's left? What does it truly mean to desire another person, not as a character in our story, but as they actually are, in all their real, messy, wounded humanity?